Margaret Powell wiped down the counter of the Starlight Diner for what felt like the 1,000th time that day. The once busy restaurant sat quiet, with only 2 regular customers drinking coffee in the corner booth. At 67 years old, Margaret's hands showed the story of 40 years spent serving food in the small town of Lakeshire. She had kept going after her husband Frank died 5 years ago. The bell above the door rang, a sound that had become rare in recent months. Doug, the thin mail carrier, walked in with a letter that made Margaret feel worried. It was likely another notice from the bank. With fewer customers coming in and costs going up, the Starlight Diner was 3 months late on payments. The big company that owned most of Lakeshire's business district had made it clear they wanted this spot for their new space business headquarters. "Just put it with the others, Doug," Margaret said with a smile that wasn't real. After Doug left, she looked at the old pictures on the wall, photos of Frank in his Navy uniform standing proudly before the first human ship to Mars, and later pictures of the diner when it was full of space workers sharing stories about distant stars and meeting aliens. The universe had grown much bigger in the last 30 years as humans moved into space, but Lakeshire had become smaller, now just a stop between more important places. In the kitchen, her daughter Elaine checked what food they had left, looking worried. Like her mother, she refused to give up on the family business, even though her husband Alan kept saying they should sell what they could and move to one of the space stations where jobs were better. "Mom, we only have enough food for another week," Elaine called out. "Should I order more or—" The question hung in the air with no answer. Both women knew they couldn't afford to buy more food. Margaret sighed, looking around at the old but clean and well-kept diner. Frank had built this place himself after coming back from the First Contact War. "This diner fed hungry families during the food shortage of '76, she said quietly to herself. "It's not closing without a fight." The next morning, Margaret almost didn't open the diner. The bank notice Doug had delivered said they had just 30 days to pay what they owed or face final closure. She had stayed up late looking through old photo albums and remembering better days when customers filled every seat and the kitchen was busy with orders. "No use feeling sorry for yourself," she muttered as she turned the sign on the door to open and started the coffee maker. The rich smell filled the empty diner, a small comfort in hard times. By 10 o'clock, only old Mr. Gunderson had come in for his daily eggs and toast. He sat reading news on his tablet, occasionally looking up, with sad eyes at Margaret. Everyone in town knew the diner was in trouble. "Business will pick up, Maggie," he said, though they both knew he was just being kind. Around noon, Elaine arrived for her shift, bringing her 7-year-old son Peter with her. School was out for the summer, and they couldn't afford childcare. Peter sat at the counter with his learning tablet, working on math problems while occasionally helping his grandmother by folding napkins. "Any customers?" Elaine asked, tying an apron around her waist. Margaret shook her head. "Just Mr. Gunderson." Elaine's face fell, but she quickly put on a smile for her son. "Well, that means we have time to try that new pie recipe. Want to help, Peter?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Margaret felt a tightness in her chest watching them head to the kitchen. 4 generations of her family had lived above this diner. Peter was born in the apartment upstairs, just like Elaine had been. The thought of losing not just the business but their home made Margaret feel sick. The afternoon passed slowly. A few locals came in for coffee, leaving generous tips that Margaret knew they couldn't really afford. The small town of Lakeshire had been hit hard when the space mining company moved its operations to the Mars colonies. Many businesses had already closed. As closing time approached, Margaret began shutting down the kitchen. Through the front windows, she could see the new building going up across the street, a shiny glass structure that would house offices for the Colony Development Corporation, the same corporation that wanted her property. "We got another offer," Elaine said quietly, showing Margaret a message on her tablet. "They've raised their buyout price by 15%. Margaret pressed her lips together. "It's still not enough to start over somewhere else. And where would we go? This is our home." "Alan thinks we should take it," Elaine admitted. "He says, the space habitats have good schools and there are restaurant jobs on the stations." "Working for someone else, you mean?" Margaret said. "Not our own place. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Margaret's personal communicator. It was Judy from the bank. "Margaret, I wanted to call you myself instead of sending another notice," Judy said, her voice gentle but firm. "The deadline is real, this time. The higher-ups are pushing hard for this deal with CDC. "I understand," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady even as her hand trembled. "Thank you for calling, Judy." After hanging up, Margaret walked to the wall of photographs. She touched the frame holding the picture of Frank on opening day, his arm around her shoulders, both of them young and full of dreams. "I'm not sure I can save it this time, Frank," she whispered. Margaret didn't share this latest call with Elaine. Instead, she sent her daughter and grandson home early, promising to finish closing up. Once alone, she sat at the counter with the accounting books spread before her, running numbers she already knew by heart, searching for a solution that wasn't there. The Colony Development Corporation didn't just want the building, they wanted the land it sat on. The diner occupied a key corner in their plans for the new business district. Their latest offer would barely cover the bank loans, leaving little for Margaret to start over. As she turned out the lights that night, Margaret looked around the diner one last time. The worn booths where space travelers had once shared stories of new worlds. The counter where Frank had served coffee to the town's first mayor. The small stage in the corner where local musicians played on Saturday nights during better times. This wasn't just a building or a business. It was a piece of human history as people moved into space. It was her family's story, but sentiment wouldn't pay the bills and Margaret was running out of time and options. Tomorrow would be another day of hoping for customers who wouldn't come, of pretending for Elaine's sake that things would get better. Margaret touched the Dr. frame lightly as she left, the way Frank used to do every night for good luck. She would need more than luck now. She would need a miracle. The next morning brought heavy rain to Lakeshire. Margaret stared out the diner windows at the empty street, wondering if it was even worth opening. Still, habit made her turn on the lights and start the coffee maker. The familiar tasks gave her comfort, even if they seemed pointless now. She had just finished setting up when the bell above the door rang. Margaret turned, expecting to see Mr. Gunderson, but instead saw a stranger. A tall, broad-shouldered man with short gray hair and a straight back that showed he had been in the military, stood in the doorway. He walked with a slight limp as he made his way to the counter. "Morning, ma'am," he said, taking off a worn cap. His voice was deep and friendly. "Name's William Carson. Someone told me this is the place to get a good cup of coffee in this part of the galaxy." Margaret smiled despite her sad mood. "You were told right, at least about the coffee. Can't say much for anything else these days." William sat on a stool at the counter, looking around with interest at the old-style decor. His right hand was not real. It was a metal one given to veterans of the Centauri conflict. A patch on his jacket showed he had been part of the 8th Orbital Defense Division. "I'll have whatever you're known for," he said. "Been traveling a long time." As Margaret made her famous apple pie and coffee, she noticed the man looking carefully at the photographs on the wall. "Your husband?" he asked, pointing to Frank's picture. "Yes, Frank Powell. He served on the Triton Expeditionary Force." William's eyes got wider. "The TF? They were the ones who held back the aliens at Neptune when the Arcturus fleet first came to our solar system." Margaret nodded. "That's where we met. I worked in communications on the space station." She put the pie and coffee in front of him. William took a bite and closed his eyes for a moment. "This tastes just like the pies my mother used to make," he said. "Real food, not the fake stuff they serve on space stations." While he ate, William asked questions about the town, the diner, and listened carefully as Margaret reluctantly told him about her struggles to keep the place open. "Why does the Colony Company want this spot so badly?" William asked. Margaret sighed. Something about the land being the perfect corner for their new building. Plus, Frank built this place on what used to be the old town center. The ground underneath has historical importance. Places like this, they're more than just businesses, William said, looking around. They're living history. They talked for nearly an hour. William told stories about his 20 years in space defense. He had been at the Second Battle of Europa and had helped set up the peace talks with the Arcturus leaders. Margaret found herself sharing memories of the early days, of space travel, when ships were slow and dangerous. My Frank always said that space was just another ocean, she told William, and every ocean needs lighthouses and safe harbors. William nodded. He was right. That's what places like this are. Harbors for those of us who've been out in the deep too long. When he asked for his bill, Margaret handed it over with a small smile. It was just 5 credits for the pie and coffee. William looked at it, then pulled out a payment chip. When he placed it on the reader, Margaret gasped as she saw the amount, 500 credits, enough to buy supplies for a month. There must be some mistake, she began. No mistake, William replied firmly. That meal gave me back something I lost out there between the stars. That's worth something extra. Margaret tried to refuse. I can't take this much for just coffee and pie. It's not just for today, William said. It's for what this place means. Places that remember who we are and where we came from are getting rare, especially as we move further into space. Before leaving, he paused at the door. Mind if I take a picture? Got some friends who might like to know about this place. Margaret agreed, confused but grateful. William used his comm device to take several pictures of the diner, making sure to get the wall of photographs. Are you staying in town long? Margaret asked. William shook his head. Just passing through. Got a meeting at the Colony Company headquarters tomorrow, then heading out to Proxima Station. After William left, Margaret stared at the payment screen. 500 credits would help, but it wasn't enough to save the diner. Still, it gave her a small bit of hope, like finding a single star in a dark sky. That afternoon, Elaine came in with Peter. When Margaret told her about the strange visitor and his generous payment, Elaine looked skeptical. That's nice, Mom, but one big tip isn't going to fix our problems, she said, looking at the latest bills. Alan says we should make a decision by the end of the week. The Colony Company won't keep their offer open forever. Margaret felt her brief moment of hope fading. I know, dear, but it was nice to be reminded that what we do here still matters to someone. The rest of the day passed quietly. A few locals came in for early dinner, talking in low voices about the latest layoffs at the spaceport. Margaret served them with her usual care, though her heart felt heavy. That night, after closing, Margaret sat again with her account books. Even with William's generous tip, they were still far short of what they needed. As she was about to turn out the lights, her comm device pinged with an incoming message. It was from an unfamiliar address. Ms. Powell, my name is Captain Patricia Winters of the Solar Defense Fleet. A mutual friend suggested I contact you. Several members of my crew and I will be passing through Lakeshore tomorrow, and would very much like to visit your establishment. Is it possible to reserve space for 15 people at 1300 hours? Margaret read the message twice, not quite believing it. 15 customers at once would be their busiest day in months. She quickly sent a reply confirming the reservation. As she walked upstairs to her apartment above the diner, Margaret wondered if William had something to do with this sudden interest. It seemed too much of a coincidence otherwise. The next morning, Margaret woke early. If 15 people were really coming, she needed to prepare. She called Elaine. Can you come in early? And ask Alan if he can help in the kitchen. We have a big group coming. A big group? Who? Elaine sounded surprised. Space. Fleet personnel, apparently. 15 of them. The skepticism in Elaine's voice was clear. Mom, are you sure this is real? It might be some kind of prank. Only one way to find out, Margaret replied. Be here by 11, please. Margaret spent the morning cleaning every surface until it shined. She took out Frank's old recipes, the ones they hadn't used in years because the ingredients were too expensive. Today, she decided, they would do things right, costs be damned. If this was to be one of the Starlight Diner's last meals, it would be one to remember. At 12:30, Elaine, Alan, and Margaret stood ready in the diner. Alan had taken the day off from his computer job to help. He still thought they should sell the place, but he loved his mother-in-law enough to pitch in. Are you sure they're coming? He asked, checking his watch. Maybe it was just the bell above the door cut him off. A woman in a crisp Space Fleet uniform walked in. She had short blonde hair and the confident walk of someone used to giving orders. 3 gold bars on her collar marked her as a captain. "Margaret Powell?" she asked, looking directly at Margaret. "Yes, that's me," Margaret replied, wiping her hands on her apron. The woman smiled and extended her hand. "Captain Patricia Winters, Solar Defense Fleet. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice." Before Margaret could respond, the bell rang again. 2 more uniformed officers entered, followed by several others. Within minutes, the diner filled with men and women in various military uniforms. Some wore the blue of the Solar Defense Fleet, others the gray of the Colonial Guard, and a few had the black uniforms of Special Operations. Margaret noticed that many of them had artificial limbs, scars, or other signs of injury. She realized they were veterans, not active duty personnel. Captain Winters spoke up as the last of her group entered. "We're all here, 15, as promised." Margaret, Elaine, and Alan scrambled to seat everyone. The diner hadn't been this full in years. The veterans took every booth and table, filling the once-empty restaurant with voices and life. "What can I get you all?" Margaret asked, pen poised over her order pad. A man with a neural implant visible at his temple spoke up. "We heard about something called the Remembrance Special. We'd all like to try that." Margaret blinked in confusion. There was no such item on their menu. Captain Winters smiled at Margaret's confusion. "William Carson posted about your diner on the Veterans Network. He said you served him something that reminded him of what we're fighting for out in space. He called it the Remembrance Special. The post has gone all through the fleet." "William, the man who was here yesterday?" Margaret asked. "That's him," said another veteran, a woman with sergeant's stripes. "He's got quite a following. When he recommends something, people listen." Elaine stepped forward. "We don't have a dish called that, but we can make something special for you all." Margaret thought quickly. "Frank's favorite," she said. "My husband's favorite meal was meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and apple pie for dessert. He was tough like some of you." A murmur of approval went through the group. Captain Winters nodded. "That sounds perfect. 15 remembrance specials, then." Alan hurried to the kitchen to start cooking while Elaine and Margaret took drink orders. The veterans settled in, talking among themselves about ships and stations and battles. As Margaret moved between tables with coffee, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Heard the Arcturus ambassador is visiting Earth next month. New colony on Tau Ceti is looking for security staff. Carson said this place has been here since before first contact." A tall man with a prosthetic leg stopped her as she passed. "Ma'am, is that Frank Powell in that photo? From the Triton Expeditionary Force?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, my husband." The man stood and saluted the picture. "Ma'am, your husband saved my father's life at the Neptune defense line. If not for the TF, none of us would be here." One by one, other veterans noticed and also stood to salute Frank's photo. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she watched these strangers honor her husband. In the kitchen, Alan worked faster than he ever had, preparing 15 full meals. Margaret and Elaine moved quickly between tables, serving and refilling drinks. For a few hours, the diner felt like it had years ago, busy, important, necessary. As the veterans ate, they shared stories. Some had been to distant stars. Others had fought in the Centauri conflict or helped establish the first human colonies outside our solar system. A few had even met alien species and learned their languages. One woman with commander's stripes approached Margaret quietly. "Your husband's diner was famous among the old TEF crews," she said. "They used to say if you made it back from the outer planets, Powell would have a hot meal waiting." Margaret hadn't known this. Frank had never told her how much his simple diner had meant to his fellow service members. Captain Winters finished her meal and stood up. "Mrs. Powell, this was excellent. Exactly what we needed. Space Fleet rations keep you alive, but meals like this remind you why you want to live." When it came time to pay, each veteran insisted on leaving far more than the cost of their meal. By the end of the afternoon, Margaret's payment account had received more money than the previous 2 months combined. But even more surprising was what happened next. Captain Winters handed Margaret a small data chip. "What's this?" Margaret asked. "Messages from other veterans who can't make it here in person. They want to support your diner. There are also some memories of your husband from those who served with him." As the group prepared to leave, the sergeant who had spoken earlier approached. "Ma'am, would it be all right if we took a group photo here? To post on the network?" "Of course," Margaret said, still overwhelmed by the day's events. The veterans gathered in front of the wall of photographs. With Frank's picture visible above them, they stood tall, a mix of artificial limbs and battle scars among them, but all wearing proud smiles. After they left, Margaret, Elaine, and Alan sat in a booth, exhausted but happy. "What just happened?" Alan asked, running a hand through his hair. Elaine checked the payment account on her tablet and gasped. "Mom, we made more today than in the last 8 weeks combined." Margaret looked at the data chip Captain Winters had given her. "I think William Carson did more than leave a big tip yesterday. He told people about us." That evening, as Elaine and Alan took Peter home, Margaret stayed to clean up. She connected the data chip to her tablet and began reading the messages. There were hundreds of them. Veterans from all over the solar system and beyond, sharing memories of the Starlight Diner or of Frank, sending well wishes and promises to visit when they could. One message caught her eye. It was from William Carson. "Mrs. Powell, by now you've probably had some visitors. There are more coming. What you've preserved there isn't just a diner, it's a piece of our shared history. In a time when humanity is spreading among the stars and changing faster than ever before, places like yours help us remember who we are and where we came from. You're not just serving food, you're serving our collective memory. And that's worth saving. The Veterans Network has your back now. Stand by for reinforcements." Margaret looked around the diner, the old booths, the counter where Frank had stood for so many years, the wall of photographs documenting humanity's journey to space. For the first time in months, she felt real hope. The bell above the door rang again. Margaret looked up, surprised to have a customer so late. A group of 4 people in civilian clothes stood in the doorway. "Are you still open?" one asked. "We heard this is where veterans are gathering. Our transport to the Mars colony leaves tomorrow, and we wanted to try the Remembrance Special before we go." Margaret smiled and reached for her apron. "Come in. I'm always open for hungry travelers." Over the next week, Margaret hardly had time to think. The diner that had been nearly empty for months was now full from opening until closing. Veterans continued to arrive in groups, sometimes traveling hours just to eat at the Starlight Diner. Civilians came too, curious about the sudden popularity of the old restaurant. Elaine had to quit her part-time job at the town office to help full-time at the diner. Alan started helping in the evenings and on weekends. Even young Peter pitched in, greeting customers and helping to clean tables. "I don't understand," Elaine said one night as they counted the day's earnings. "How did this happen so fast?" Margaret showed her the Veterans Network on her tablet. William Carson's original post about the diner had been shared thousands of times. Veterans across the solar system were discussing the Starlight Diner, posting pictures of their visits and encouraging others to make the trip to Lakeshore. "It's not just about the food," Margaret explained. "For them, this place is a connection to the past, to what Earth was like before we went to the stars." On the 8th day after William's visit, a news team arrived from the Solar Federation News Network. A young reporter named Lily set up her camera in the corner of the diner. "Mrs. Powell, can you tell our viewers how your small-town diner became the center of a veterans movement?" she asked, pointing her microphone at Margaret. Margaret looked confused. "A movement? We're just serving food," Lily smiled. "You haven't seen the full story? Your diner has inspired veterans across Earth and the colonies to identify other family-owned businesses with connections to service members. They're calling themselves anchors, places that keep our expanding civilization connected to its roots." That evening, Margaret, Elaine, and Alan watched the news report on the large screen in the diner. William Carson appeared, speaking from what looked like a space station. "When you've been out there facing the unknown, defending humanity against threats most people can't understand, Coming home can be the hardest mission of all, he said. Finding places that connect us to what we're protecting, family businesses, community spaces. That's not just about feeling good. It's necessary for healing. The report showed other businesses across Earth, and even on some colonies. A barber shop in New Sydney, a bookstore in the Lunar Dome, a small farm outside the Mars Colony Dome. All were family-owned. All had connections to military service, and all were now being supported by the Anchors movement. It's bigger than us, Elaine whispered, watching the report. The next morning, Doug the mail carrier arrived with a different kind of letter. This one wasn't a bank notice but an official message from the Colony Development Corporation. I thought you'd want this right away, Doug said, his eyes wide. It's got the CEO's personal signature. Margaret opened the letter with shaking hands. As she read, her expression changed from worry to shock. What is it, Mom? Elaine asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she came from the kitchen. The corporation is withdrawing their plan to take over this property, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. They say they've reconsidered due to the historical and cultural significance of the establishment. That's corporate talk for, we don't want to anger thousands of veterans, Alan said with a laugh. Later that day, Judy from the bank called. Margaret, you won't believe this, she said, sounding excited. The bank is offering to refinance your loan at a much lower rate. They're calling it the Historical Business Preservation Program, but it's brand new and honestly, I think they created it just for you. By the end of the second week, the Starlight Diner had made enough money to catch up on all its late payments. Margaret had to hire 3 new staff members to help with the constant flow of customers. One afternoon, as Margaret was showing a group of veterans an old photo of the first human Mars landing, the bell above the door rang. She looked up and saw William Carson walking in. This time, he wasn't alone. A tall woman with the straight posture of a military officer walked beside him. Mrs. Powell, William said with a wide smile. Good to see you again. Margaret hurried over to him. Mr. Carson, I have so much to thank you for. William shook his head. I just told the truth about a good meal and an important place. The rest happened because it needed to happen. He gestured to the woman beside him. This is Dr. Lydia Martinez, the new CEO of the Colony Development Corporation. Margaret's smile faded slightly. Oh, I received your letter about withdrawing the plans for this property. Dr. Martinez nodded. Yes, but that's not why I'm here today. William has convinced me that the Starlight Diner represents something valuable that my company hadn't considered in our development plans. And what's that? Margaret asked. Continuity, Dr. Martinez said. As we build new colonies in space, we focus on the future, but William helped me understand that people need connections to their past, to Earth, to human traditions. That's why I'm here with a new proposal. Over coffee and apple pie, Dr. Martinez explained her idea. Instead of tearing down the diner to build offices, the corporation wanted to help expand it. They would build their new headquarters nearby, but they would include a Veterans Cultural Center connected to the diner. The center would serve as a museum documenting humanity's journey to the stars, Dr. Martinez explained, showing designs on her tablet. It would feature stories of those who made that journey possible, with a special section dedicated to the Triton Expeditionary Force. William added, We want to include training facilities where veterans can teach traditional skills, cooking, crafts, arts, things that might be lost as we rely more on machines. Margaret looked at the plans in amazement. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Elaine said, looking over her mother's shoulder at the designs. Dad would have loved this. As they discussed details, more veterans arrived at the diner. When they recognized William, they came over to thank him for starting the Anchors movement. William kept redirecting their thanks to Margaret. She's the one who kept this place going when it would have been easier to give up, he told them. All I did was let people know it was here. That evening after the diner closed, Margaret sat at a booth with William, Dr. Martinez, Elaine, and Alan. They talked late into the night about their vision for the diner and the cultural center. It's going to take work, Dr. Martinez warned, and time. But my company is committed to making this happen. Why the change of heart? Alan asked. Just a month ago, Your company was trying to force us out. Dr. Martinez looked thoughtful. My grandfather was a terraformer on the first Mars colony. He used to tell me stories about coming back to Earth and feeling like a stranger here. He said the hardest part of going to space wasn't leaving Earth. It was coming back and finding it changed. She gestured around the diner. Places like this, that maintain traditions while we push forward, they're not obstacles to progress. They're essential parts of it. They help us remember who we are even as we change what we can become. As Margaret locked up that night, she paused by Frank's photo. You always said this place was more than just somewhere to eat, she whispered. You were right. Outside, the stars were becoming visible in the evening sky. The same stars that had once seemed so distant and now were dotted with human settlements. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began planning the expansion. But for now, Margaret was content knowing that the light of the Starlight Diner would continue to shine, a beacon for travelers far from home. 2 years passed quickly. The small town of Lakeshire had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The Starlight Diner stood at the center of it all, no longer just a struggling restaurant, but the heart of something much bigger. On a clear, spring morning, Margaret stood outside the diner watching as William Carson cut a red ribbon stretched across the entrance of the new Veterans Cultural Center. A crowd of people cheered, locals, veterans, visitors from across Earth, and even from the space colonies. I declare the Starlight Veterans Cultural Center officially open, William announced, his voice strong despite his age. Margaret looked at the new building with pride. Connected to the original diner by a glass walkway, the center was 3 times larger than the restaurant but designed to match its classic style. The Colony Development Corporation had kept their promise, funding most of the construction while allowing Margaret's family to maintain ownership. Inside the center, displays showed the history of human space exploration. One wall was devoted entirely to the Triton Expeditionary Force with Frank's picture in the center. Interactive screens let visitors experience what life was like aboard early colony ships or defense platforms. A memorial garden in the back honored those who never returned from the stars. Most importantly, the center included classrooms where veterans taught traditional skills, cooking, woodworking, art, that might otherwise be lost in an age when machines did most of the work. Technology changes, but human hands still create with heart that machines cannot match, William often said. The diner itself remained largely unchanged, though it had been carefully restored. Margaret had insisted on keeping the old booths, the counter, and the original kitchen equipment, though they had added modern safety features. As people moved from the ribbon-cutting ceremony into the center, Margaret found herself standing next to Elaine and Peter, now 9 years old. "Grandma, look!" Peter pointed to the sky where ships were landing at the spaceport. "There are 3 more transport ships coming in." The spaceport, which had been nearly shut down 2 years ago, was now bustling with activity. Lakeshire had become a popular stop for space travelers wanting to experience authentic Earth culture before heading to the colonies or after returning from deep space. Alan approached, looking unusually happy in his new uniform as the center's technology director. "The alien representatives are arriving," he said quietly. "Dr. Martinez is greeting them now." Margaret nodded, still amazed that representatives from 14 alien species had accepted invitations to the opening. The Arcturus ambassador, from the very species humanity had once fought against, had been particularly interested in the project. "Mom," Elaine said, "you should be the one to show them around. This wouldn't exist without you." Margaret shook her head. "This exists because of all of us, you, Alan, William, even Peter." She smiled at her grandson. "And Frank, of course." Inside the center, visitors moved through the exhibits, many stopping to share their own stories of space travel or military service. The diner was filled to capacity, with a line stretching out the door. Now managed by Elaine, with 6 full-time cooks, it served the famous Remembrance Special all day, every day. Margaret found herself approached by a tall figure with blue-tinted skin and large eyes, the Arcturus ambassador. A translator device floated beside them. "Powell Human, The translator spoke as the ambassador made musical sounds. Your preservation of memory places surprises our understanding. We assumed your species' rapid technological growth meant abandoning your past. Instead, you carry it with you to the stars. Margaret smiled. We need our past to guide our future. The diner reminds us where we came from, even as we move forward. The ambassador made a gesture that the translator didn't convert, but Margaret understood was a sign of respect. As the day continued, Margaret slipped away from the crowds. She went to the small office behind the diner's kitchen, Frank's oldie office, now hers. There, she touched the photograph of Frank in his uniform, now framed beside William's original payment chip from 2 years ago, the unexpected event that had saved not just her diner, but had sparked a movement. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. William stood there looking tired but happy. Quite a day, he said. Everything you hoped for? More than I ever imagined, Margaret replied. When you came in that rainy morning, I was ready to give up. William shrugged. I just wanted some apple pie. You did all the hard work keeping this place alive when it would have been easier to let it go. Why did you really leave that big tip that day? Margaret asked, a question she had wondered about for 2 years. William was quiet for a moment. I'd been in space for nearly 15 years straight, he finally said. When I came back to Earth, nothing felt like home anymore. Everything had changed. Then I walked into your diner, and suddenly I remembered what it was like to feel connected to something real. That's worth more than money. They returned to the main room where Dr. Martinez was giving a speech about the Anchors program, which now included over 500 businesses across Earth and the colonies. What began as one veteran's appreciation for a small-town diner has grown into a movement preserving humanity's cultural heritage as we expand throughout the stars, she said, gesturing to William. The Starlight Veterans Cultural Center is our flagship project, but similar centers are being built on Mars, Europa, and even on the Proxima Centauri colony. Later, as the celebrations continued, Margaret found herself back behind the counter of the diner, pouring coffee for visitors. It felt right to be there, doing what she had done for 40 years. A young woman in a crisp new Space Fleet uniform approached the counter. Mrs. Powell? She asked nervously. That's me, Margaret smiled. What can I get you? I'm shipping out tomorrow on my first deep space assignment, the young woman said. Everyone at the academy says I should try the Remembrance special before I go. Margaret nodded, already reaching for a plate. Coming right up. First deployment? Yes, ma'am. 3-year mission to Tau Ceti. As Margaret prepared the meal, she noticed the young woman looking at the wall of photographs, particularly at the newest editions. Pictures of the first anchor businesses on other planets. The Veterans Network says that every human outpost should have a place like this, the young woman said. Somewhere that reminds us what we're protecting out there. Margaret set the plate in front of her. And when you're out there among the stars, remember, you'll always have a place to come, home to. As night fell, the crowds finally thinned. Margaret stood in the doorway of the diner looking up at the stars. The same stars that had once seemed so distant were now dotted with human settlements. The diner's namesake, the brightest star in the night sky, shone down on a business that had become much more. A connection point between humanity's past and its future among those very stars. The bell above the door jingled as Elaine joined her mother. Ready to close up? She asked. Margaret shook her head. No, I think we should stay open a little longer tonight. There might be more hungry travelers coming. And there were.